Welcome, gentle soul, to another quiet journey through time. Tonight, we wander beyond the walls of kings and into the stone hearts of their strongholds, the castles of the Middle Ages. These were not just fortresses of war, but living worlds of craft, fear, and quiet brilliance. You'll hear the echo of footsteps on cold stone floors, the creak of drawbridges, and the whisper of torchlight against carved walls. As the world outside fades, let your mind drift into these ancient halls. Perhaps you're listening as sleep begins to settle in, or maybe you're simply seeking calm before the night. However you arrived, I'm grateful you're here. If this gentle walk through history brings you peace, I'd love for you to subscribe, so we can keep exploring together, one quiet story at a time. You open your eyes to a grey morning somewhere in early medieval Europe. The air smells faintly of damp earth and wood smoke. A crow circles lazily overhead. Below you, on a low hill rising from the mist, stands something both crude and ingenious. A mound of earth crowned with timber walls. It is not yet the grand stone castle that centuries of imagination will conjure, but in this moment, it is the future. This is the age before stone keeps and machicolations, before concentric walls and murder holes, before the very word castle meant permanence. It is a time of rebuilding from collapse. After the fall of Rome, Europe became a patchwork of uncertainty. Old roads were broken, trade faltered. The great villas of Roman nobles, once adorned with mosaic floors and running water, lay in ruins or had been repurposed as animal shelters. Power scattered like dust in the wind, taken up by warlords and chieftains who held more land than loyalty. And in that landscape of constant tension, the need to build quickly, defend hastily, and survive, something new emerged: the Motte and Bailey. At first glance, it was a simple design. But within its simplicity lay the seed of an entire architectural philosophy, one that would shape Europe's skyline for centuries. The Motte was nothing more than a raised mound, sometimes natural, often artificial, built from heaped earth and clay. It could rise 20 or 30 feet above the surrounding ground, sometimes higher, and at its summit, a timber tower stood, ringed by a wooden palisade. This was the Lord's last refuge, the place where he could look down upon his domain and, if necessary, make his final stand. Below the Motte lay the Bailey, an enclosed courtyard protected by another wooden fence, where the daily life of the small community unfolded. Here were the stables, kitchens, workshops, and barracks. Chickens scratched the dirt near the blacksmith's shed. The rhythmic clang of hammer on iron echoed faintly across the yard. The entire structure could be built in a matter of weeks, sometimes days, if the need was urgent. No marble, no carved stone, no ornate sculpture. Only the resources close at hand: earth and timber. And yet, despite this modesty, it was revolutionary, because for the first time in post-Roman Europe, a single man could command both height and visibility. From the top of his wooden tower, he could see miles in every direction, not only the land he ruled, but the threats that approached it. The genius of the Motte and Bailey lay not in beauty, but in practicality. You might think of it as a response to fear: fear of raids, fear of rebellion, fear of uncertainty. The 10th and 11th centuries were restless centuries. Viking ships slipped along rivers that snaked deep into the continent. Magyar horsemen swept westward from the Hungarian plains. Local feuds broke out between neighbouring lords with nothing more to gain than a few acres or the right to collect tolls from a bridge. To survive was to build, quickly and cleverly. In England, before the Norman conquest, few such structures existed. The Anglo-Saxons relied instead on burhs, fortified towns, but these were civic defences, not private ones. The Normans would change everything. When William, Duke of Normandy, crossed the Channel in 1066, he brought not only soldiers but an idea: the Motte and Bailey Castle as a tool of occupation and control. Within months of the Battle of Hastings, England was dotted with new timber fortresses, each one a statement. We are here. We rule now. They were built on river crossings, near roads, beside old Roman towns, sometimes right over existing settlements. In some cases, villagers were simply displaced to make room for the earthworks. Chroniclers note with quiet bitterness how the ground was torn up and piled high, the labour done by local hands under Norman supervision. The design was simple but standardised, the first hint of medieval engineering becoming almost scientific. A circular or oval motte was raised from layers of soil, reinforced with sods or wooden revetments to prevent erosion. Around it, a ditch was dug, sometimes dry, sometimes filled with water if the ground allowed. The bailey extended below, enclosed by a palisade of sharpened logs set into a ditch and bank. One narrow causeway connected the two, a defensible choke point that could be easily destroyed if attackers breached the lower ward. It was, in essence, a miniature ecosystem of control. The men who lived within these wooden walls did not think of themselves as architects. They were soldiers, stewards, craftsmen, peasants, priests. But together, they sustained a fragile rhythm of survival. Inside the bailey, life went on at a pace defined by necessity. Fires burned in open hearths. Horses were fed and watered before dawn. Grain was stored in raised wooden granaries to keep out the damp. At night, the gates were closed and the drawbridge lifted. Beyond the palisade, the world was dark and unknown. If you stood there, listening to the wind move through the wooden walls, hearing the low murmur of guards exchanging stories by the fire, you would sense both the vulnerability and brilliance of early castle life. It was a system built on impermanence, yet it created the illusion of safety. The earliest chroniclers called these fortresses castella, a Latin echo of the word castrum, meaning fort or camp. But there was something new here, a personal element. These were not state-built defences like the old Roman forts. They were private strongholds, symbols of individual power, and power, as always, invited imitation. Soon, the Motte and bailey spread across Europe like a quiet contagion. In Normandy and Brittany, they appeared first on hilltops, then along rivers. In Scotland and Ireland, they were raised in haste by Norman lords seeking new lands. In Wales, entire valleys were reshaped by their construction. Each region adapted the idea to its landscape. In wet, low-lying areas, artificial mounds had to be carefully drained and compacted to avoid collapse. In rocky regions, masons carved the motte directly from stone, blurring the line between natural terrain and human labour. There is an understated genius in this adaptability. The Motte and bailey was never a rigid design. It was an evolving response to circumstance. Historians estimate that over 1,000 of them once dotted the English landscape alone. Most have long vanished. The timber rotted away, the mounds eroded by centuries of rain. Yet if you look carefully, you can still see them. Smooth, circular rises in the earth, often mistaken for natural hills. Sheep graze over them now. Children roll down their sides. The shape of defense, absorbed into the landscape of peace. But what made this design so enduring wasn't just its practicality, it was its psychology. To those living under its shadow, the castle was both reassurance and reminder. Safety for those inside, subjugation for those outside. The raised mound and palisade said, without words, that power lived here. Even in timber, the visual language was unmistakable. Height, enclosure, control of approach. And for the first time since Rome's fall, Europe began to think again in terms of layers, inner and outer, strong and weak, lord and subject. The idea of fortification had returned, not as an imperial project, but as a personal necessity. Yet timber, for all its convenience, was never eternal. Fires could consume it, rot could weaken it, and termites could hollow its core. For every tower that rose quickly, another fell within a generation. And still, the idea persisted. Because once humanity discovered the comfort of walls, once it learned the strange peace that comes from standing above and looking out, it would never return to open ground. By the end of the 11th century, The Motte and Bailey was everywhere, and yet already it was outgrowing itself. Lords began to crave something more permanent. They wanted their authority not only seen, but remembered. Stone had always been there, heavy, immovable, ancient. It had outlasted Rome, outlasted emperors, outlasted wood. And soon, it would begin to rise again. The transition from timber to stone would take decades, sometimes centuries, but it would change everything. The landscape, the labor force, the economy, even the way people imagined power itself. The Motte and Bailey had served its purpose, to teach medieval Europe how to build, how to plan, and how to think defensively again. The next generation would take those lessons and carve them into the earth forever. You can still stand on one of those early mounds today if you know where to look. At first, it seems like nothing, a grassy rise beside a quiet river, sheep wandering nearby. But if you close your eyes, you might almost hear it. The creak of timber, the clatter of hooves, the sound of distant hammering. The breath of a guard on a cold dawn shift, waiting for nothing in particular, except to be relieved at sunrise. It is a silence filled with memory. And as the centuries begin to turn, the question slowly takes shape in the damp morning air. If this was only the beginning, if earth and timber were merely the first step, then what exactly would humanity build next to keep itself safe? The wooden towers of the Motte and Bailey were not built merely for safety. They were built for authority. A castle was never just a collection of defences, it was a statement. And the man who stood upon the Motte, looking down upon the land and people below, embodied something far larger than himself. He was both protector and master, both guardian and oppressor. The genius of the early castle was not only in its walls, but in the social structure that rose within and around them. In the centuries after the Norman conquest, a quiet order began to take hold across Europe, a world bound together by feudalism. Imagine, for a moment, that you are a Norman knight newly rewarded for service in war. You have followed your lord across the Channel, fought in muddy fields, and now, for your loyalty, you have been granted land. But this is not just any land. It comes with obligations, promises, and expectations. You owe allegiance to the man above you, perhaps a baron, perhaps the king himself, and in return, you command those below, the peasants who farm your fields, the soldiers who guard your gate, the craftsmen who build your hall. Your castle, even if made of wood, is the physical shape of that hierarchy. It is a diagram of society, drawn in soil and timber. The Motte represents you, elevated, watchful, above. The Bailey represents your household, your retainers, servants, and soldiers. And beyond the ditch, stretching toward the horizon, lies the village, the world that sustains you. From this simple geometry grew a civilization built on obedience and fear, but also on cooperation and routine. The castle, as it spread across Norman England and northern France, served as both fortress and courthouse. Here, justice was dispensed, rents were collected, and disputes were settled beneath the eyes of the Lord's banner. Within its walls, the rhythm of power was quiet but absolute. At dawn, trumpets or horns might sound to summon guards to their stations. The cook fires in the bailey would be lit. Men-at-arms would polish their chainmail, oiling iron to keep away the creeping rust. The lord, perhaps wrapped in a fur-lined cloak, would emerge from the tower to walk along the timber wall-walks, a visible reminder to all below that he saw everything. It was surveillance before the word existed. The villagers outside the ditch worked the fields that fed the garrison. Their labour filled the castle granaries. Their taxes maintained the walls, and in times of danger, rebellion, raiding, famine, they fled behind those same walls, seeking the protection of the very man who demanded their obedience. It was a circle of dependence. The Lord needed their harvests. They needed his fortifications. For all its inequalities, it was a system that worked, not through efficiency, but through endurance. Feudal power was personal, and the castle made that visible. Unlike the vast bureaucracies of Rome, the medieval world ran on relationships, oaths spoken aloud, sealed not with contracts, but with ritual. A vassal might kneel before his lord, hands clasped between the other's palms, swearing fealty to serve with life and limb. The lord, in turn, would grant land, a fief, and with it, the right to rule. Every motte and bailey was, in essence, the architectural form of that relationship. To the peasants looking up at the tower, the image was unmistakable. The man who lived above them was, by all visible measures, above them. His position on the mound was no accident. It was ideology made physical. The castle on the hill said something simple and unanswerable. Power has a height, but the authority of the Lord was not limitless. Every small castle was part of a greater chain of loyalty stretching upward. Baron to earl, earl to duke, duke to king. And at the top of this living pyramid stood the monarch, whose claim to divine right gave the entire system its fragile legitimacy. Yet even kings feared the independence of castle lords. A well-fortified motte could become a centre of resistance. A rebellious baron could hold out for months, defying royal orders while flying his own banner. That is why, in many regions, kings limited who could build in stone. Timber, being temporary, could be tolerated. Stone, however, was permanence. A declaration that a lord's authority would outlast the man himself. So, as you look upon the wooden walls of an early motte, you are also looking at politics in its purest form, a structure of control that both empowered and endangered the one who built it. Inside the wooden keep, life was surprisingly modest. The hall at the tower's summit was both home and office, courtroom and dining room. Rushes covered the floor. Tapestries, if they existed, were rare and coarse. The smell of smoke and tallow hung in the air. In one corner stood a chest containing documents and coins, the physical tokens of the lord's wealth. Meals were simple: bread, salted meat, ale. Perhaps, on feast days, a roasted pig or venison. The lord sat at the high table, his family beside him, his knights further down. The walls might echo with conversation, news from other estates, rumours of raids, discussions of crops and rents. There was laughter too sometimes, and songs. For even among the powerful, life was as much about waiting as it was about ruling. Outside in the bailey, work never stopped. Blacksmiths shaped horseshoes and spearheads. Carpenters replaced rotting beams. The stable hands fed and brushed the lord's horses, prized possessions as important as any weapon. At night, the castle quieted. Torches flickered in the wind. The watchman on the palisade looked out over the darkened countryside, listening for the faintest sound, the bark of a dog, the rustle of movement beyond the ditch. They stood on rotation, hour after hour, guarding not only lives but an entire order of society. To the villagers living in the shadow of the motte, the castle was a paradox. It brought security, from raiders, from wolves, from rival lords, yet it also brought burden. Taxes were collected not by distant officials, but by men they saw daily. Labour was demanded for repairs, harvests, and the endless digging of ditches. And yet, many accepted this balance as natural. For in a world without central authority, the local lord was the only constant. His banner marked the edge of safety. His walls, the limit of law. It is easy now to see only oppression in such a system, but for many, feudal life offered something rare in those centuries: predictability. One knew where power lay and what it demanded. Over time, castles became more than defensive refuges. They were administrative centres. Documents were stored in the keep. Clerks began to appear, literate men who could manage estates and record taxes. Priests established chapels within the walls, turning the castle into a microcosm of medieval order, authority, economy, and faith under one roof. Each fortress became a small, self-contained universe. And as the decades passed, the men who ruled from these mounds began to see their wooden walls differently. The motte no longer felt like the pinnacle of power. It was temporary, prone to decay, and sometimes even dangerous. Fires were a constant risk. Stone offered something wood could not: endurance. and with endurance came legacy. By the early 12th century, the first transformations had begun. Lords who had once ruled from timber towers now dreamed of square keeps, massive stone blocks that could not be burned or cut. The old mottes were sometimes levelled, sometimes encased in masonry. What began as an earthwork soon became architecture. But before that transition could take full shape, the idea of lordship itself had to mature, to expand from simple occupation to something closer to governance. The wooden motte had taught Europe that power could be built, raised, and seen. The coming of stone would teach it that power could also be remembered. Even now, standing on a modern hillside, where one of those early forts once stood, you can sense the hierarchy embedded in the land. The mound still rises, the ditch still curves faintly around it. It no longer defends anything, yet its shape tells a quiet story of human beings arranging their world to mirror their fears and ambitions. The lord on his hill was not just defending himself, he was defining his place in the order of things. He built his home above others, not merely to see farther, but to be seen. It is perhaps the oldest impulse of power, to rise, and in rising, to remain. And as the wooden towers began to decay, and lords turned their gaze towards stone, another question began to whisper through Europe's restless air. If a man's authority could be built from earth and wood, what might it become when carved from the bones of the earth itself? You stand again upon that same hill, but the world around you has begun to change. The wind carries a new sound, heavier, deeper, the sound of hammers striking chisel against stone. The once familiar crack of timber has faded. Sawdust is replaced by fine grey dust that clings to skin and breath alike. The wooden towers that once crowned Europe's mottes are vanishing one by one, replaced by something more permanent, more deliberate, and infinitely more ambitious. This is the beginning of the first great architectural revolution of the Middle Ages, the age when wood gave way to stone. To understand this transformation, you must first imagine the uncertainty that lingered beneath every wooden castle. Timber was quick to build, yes, but also quick to burn. A single spark from a kitchen hearth could erase months of labour. Storms could rot palisades. Termites could hollow beams. Even the mound beneath, the motte itself, could slump and crack after years of rain. For the lords who ruled from these fragile citadels, that impermanence became intolerable. Their power might be divine, but their fortresses were mortal. And so they turned to stone, a material that defied both time and fire. But to build in stone was not merely to change a material. It was to embrace a new philosophy of power, one that sought endurance rather than immediacy. The first stone castles were not built for war alone, but for memory. The earliest stone keeps were simple in shape, often square or rectangular, and remarkably plain. They rose directly from the old mottes or from newly levelled ground nearby. Their walls were thick, sometimes over 3 meters, and their interiors sparse. Inside, a central hall occupied the main floor, used for meals, gatherings, and the Lord's court. Above it, smaller chambers provided sleeping quarters, while below, in dark, airless rooms, supplies, and sometimes prisoners, were kept. Windows were narrow slits, more for defence than for light. The air was cold, the echo constant. But for all their austerity, these new keeps radiated a quiet brilliance. They were meant to last forever. The transition from wood to stone did not happen overnight. It was slow, uneven, and deeply local. In some regions, stone was plentiful. In others, scarce and costly to quarry. In England, early Norman lords began by encasing wooden structures in stone, layer by layer, as if petrifying them. Elsewhere, entire new castles were built from scratch, their mottes reshaped to support heavier walls. Every new layer of stone carried not only weight, but meaning. Stone building demanded skills that few in early medieval Europe still possessed. The masons of the 11th and 12th centuries were craftsmen of a rare kind, part artist, part engineer. They understood how to read the veins of rock, how to cut blocks to interlock like teeth, how to raise scaffolding that could hold the weight of walls taller than any barn or church. Their tools were simple: hammer, chisel, plumb line, measuring rod. But their knowledge was profound, a mix of Roman inheritance, oral tradition, and experimentation. Each new castle became both a construction site and a school, teaching lessons that would later be used to raise cathedrals. Quarrying was a slow and exhausting task. Workers used iron wedges to split limestone or sandstone from cliff faces, sometimes far from the building site. Oxen hauled the blocks on sledges and carts, sometimes over miles of uneven track. For every tower that rose, entire landscapes were quietly rearranged. Hills carved open, forests felled for scaffolding, rivers diverted to float stone by barge. And for every lord who wanted a fortress, there were hundreds of nameless labourers whose hands shaped the dream into reality. To live near a stone castle under construction was to live in the presence of constant sound, hammering, shouting, the grind of wheels and the creak of ropes. It might take 5 years, 10 years, sometimes a generation to complete. But once finished, it altered the skyline and the imagination of all who saw it. Where a wooden tower seemed provisional, a stone keep seemed absolute. It did not merely protect the land, it defined it. If you stood on a nearby road and saw a stone keep rising above the fields, you knew you were entering a world of order and authority. You could feel it before you even reached the gate. One of the earliest and most famous examples of this transformation stands still today, the White Tower in London. Commissioned by William the Conqueror around 1078, it was both fortress and symbol, built not only to guard the river, but to remind the conquered city of its new ruler. Its pale stone walls, imported from Caen in Normandy, gleamed in the sunlight, a deliberate contrast to the grey timbers of the surrounding city. It was, in every sense, a declaration. The king did not simply rule England, he built himself into it. Other lords followed suit. Across England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, wooden towers were replaced by stone ones. Castles at Rochester, Norwich, and Colchester began to rise, each different in design, but sharing the same quiet confidence. The materials may have changed, but the motive was the same: to endure. Stone, however, was not only stronger than wood, it also demanded new ways of thinking. A wooden wall could be repaired in days, a stone one required planning. A timber tower could be extended upward with relative ease. A stone keep needed careful balance, or it would collapse under its own ambition. Thus, medieval architecture slowly became an art of patience. Builders learned to think not in days or seasons, but in decades. Lords, too, had to accept that the castle they commissioned might not be finished in their lifetime. And so, castles became dynastic projects, not just homes for the living, but monuments for the dead. When a new lord inherited his father's lands, he also inherited his unfinished walls. To complete them was not just a matter of pride, but of legitimacy. Each stone laid was a continuation of authority. The shift from wood to stone also changed how people lived inside castles. Gone were the light, airy spaces of timber halls. In their place came cold chambers, thick walls, and narrow passages. Fireplaces were small, and heat rarely reached beyond a few feet from the hearth. The air was heavy with damp in winter, cool in summer, and always faintly scented with smoke and stone dust. Yet those who lived there found comfort in the permanence. To sleep behind walls that could not burn or rot was a new kind of peace, a luxury of certainty in an age of uncertainty. The castle had become a kind of promise that while men might fall, the structure and the power it represented would stand. But stone brought new dangers too. Sieges became slower, more brutal. Wooden palisades could be set aflame, but stone walls had to be starved out or broken by siege engines. The warfare of Europe began to evolve around this new material. Engineers designed heavier trebuchets, miners learned to tunnel beneath foundations, and attackers devised tricks to lure defenders out into the open. The castle, by growing stronger, had also made war more enduring. And yet, despite these risks, no lord wished to return to wood. By the early 12th century, the sight of a timber tower was already a mark of poverty or backwardness. Stone had become the new language of legitimacy. If wood was survival, stone was civilization. Walk now through the ruins of one of these early stone keeps. Perhaps the shell of a tower standing amid green fields and scattered sheep. Run your hand along the weathered limestone. You will still feel the tool marks, faint grooves left by chisels almost 1,000 years ago. Each groove is a memory of labor, each block a story of ambition. What began as the hurried construction of earthen mounds had become a deliberate act of permanence, a turning point not only in architecture but in thought itself. Because in building with stone, medieval Europe began to rediscover something it had lost since Rome. The idea that human creation could outlast human life. The wooden towers had been built to protect against chaos. The stone keeps were built to transcend it, and as they rose higher and thicker, new questions emerged. How to defend such vast structures, how to feed their growing households, and how to organize life within their unyielding walls. The next generation of castle builders would face those questions with ingenuity, turning defense into art and necessity into design. For now, though, the hammers continue to strike, each echo fading into the cool medieval air, each stone whispering the same quiet promise. This will stand when we are gone. At the heart of every medieval castle stood the keep, a word that meant more than mere stone walls. It was the core, the anchor, the place where strength and authority converged. To build a keep was to build the very soul of the fortress, a statement to the world that power here was not fleeting, but absolute. In the dawn of the 12th century, the keep had evolved far beyond the rough square towers of the early Norman age. Lords, masons, and builders were beginning to understand not only how to make a fortress stand, but how to make it live. Stone was no longer a novelty, it was the language of dominion, and the keep was the sentence carved upon the land. Imagine standing within the courtyard of a half-built castle. Around you, wooden scaffolding rises like ribs against the grey bulk of the central tower. The clang of chisels rings out, echoing across the valley. Men shout to one another in Norman French and Latin. The smell of mortar, a blend of lime, ash, and water, hangs in the air. The keep climbs slowly skyward, block by block. Beneath your feet, the foundation lies deep, sometimes as much as 12 or 15 feet below ground. The masons have laid the first stones upon firm rock if possible, or upon carefully compacted gravel if not. The base must hold not only the weight of the walls, but the centuries themselves. Every castle begins at the foundation, unseen, but essential. The lower courses of stone are the thickest, often set in a gentle slope outward called a batter, designed to deflect both rainwater and rams. As the walls rise, they taper slightly inward, giving the illusion of height and grace even as they conceal immense strength. Inside these walls, hollow passages are sometimes left, narrow tunnels that lighten the weight and provide space for staircases or arrow slits. The masons carve grooves for beams and floors, mark out chambers, and plan for the spiral staircases that will twist upward through the tower like stone vines. The keep was not built by one man or even one generation. It required an army of labourers, hundreds, sometimes thousands. There were quarrymen who cut the stone, carters who hauled it, lime burners who fed the great smoking kilns to create the mortar, and blacksmiths who forged the iron clamps and nails. Masons, the elite of the workforce, shaped the stone itself. They worked in teams called lodges, each led by a master mason, whose word was law on the site. These men understood geometry and weight in ways few others could. They used ropes and wooden frames to measure right angles, plumb bobs to ensure perfect verticals, and chalk to trace plans directly onto the ground. To the casual eye, the castle might seem a miracle of brute force, but in truth, it was an act of precision. Mathematics hidden beneath dust. Every stone had its place. Every curve had its reason. Once the outer walls of the keep were raised to their full height, the builders turned inward. Inside, the keep was divided into levels, each with its own purpose. The lowest level, often windowless and cold, was the storage cellar. Here, great barrels of ale, salted meat, and sacks of grain were kept. The air was heavy and still, perfect for preserving food through long winters or siege. Above this, the great hall occupied the main floor. It was the center of daily life, a space for feasting, judgment, and display. Long tables filled the room during meals, the lord and his household seated according to rank. Torches and braziers flickered along the walls, illuminating banners and shields. At the high end of the hall stood the dais, a raised platform where the lord and lady sat beneath a canopy, presiding over their household like monarchs in miniature. Above the hall were private chambers, smaller, warmer rooms for sleeping, conversation, and council. A spiral stair connected each floor, always turning clockwise as it rose. This was not mere whimsy. In battle, the design favored the right-handed defender striking downward against an attacker climbing up. Even in its architecture, the keep spoke the language of defense. But the keep was more than a fortress. It was also a home. Within its thick walls, the rhythms of daily life unfolded with quiet regularity. The kitchen, often set apart in a separate building to avoid fires, sent up the smells of stewing meat and fresh bread. Servants carried platters through narrow corridors, their footsteps echoing against the stone. In winter, rushes were strewn on the floors and changed periodically to mask odors. Fires burned in tall hearths, though their warmth reached only those nearest the flame. Lords wrapped themselves in furs, ladies in heavy woolen cloaks, and everyone moved slowly through the dimly lit rooms, careful not to waste candlelight. The keep was austere by modern eyes. Its beauty lay in function, not comfort. Yet to those who lived in it, it represented something far greater: safety, hierarchy, and belonging. And then there was the view. Climb the narrow spiral to the roof, and the world unfolds below you. Fields, forests, rivers, and roads. From this vantage, a lord could see his entire domain, could watch smoke rise from distant villages, or signal his men with banners and fire. The keep was a watchtower over both the land and its people. In times of peace, the view was serene, a panorama of order. But in war, it became a map of strategy. The keep's height allowed defenders to spot advancing armies long before they reached the walls. From here, orders were shouted, horns blown, and arrows loosed from parapets. To control the high ground was to control the story, and the keep ensured that no story unfolded without its witness. Yet, for all its might, the keep was not invulnerable. Its very bulk made it difficult to heat, supply, or escape from. Once an enemy breached the outer walls, defenders could retreat into the keep, but doing so meant trapping themselves inside. It was the last refuge, not the first line of defense. Sieges that reached this point were brutal affairs. The attackers might undermine the walls, tunneling beneath and burning the supports to collapse the structure. Others used great wooden towers or battering rams. The defenders relied on the thickness of their walls, on boiling oil and stones, and on time, hoping relief would come before supplies ran out. To live through a siege within a keep was to live in darkness and hunger. Fires were rationed, food carefully measured, and the sound of hammers outside never ceased. Yet for all the fear, there was also pride, for to hold the keep was to hold one's honor. As the centuries passed, keeps began to change shape and purpose. In the 12th and 13th centuries, builders experimented with new designs, round keeps instead of square, to better deflect projectiles and eliminate weak corners. The great cylindrical keep at Conisborough, with its graceful buttresses, was a marvel of this innovation. Inside, comforts slowly improved. Windows widened, staircases smoothed, and stone seats were carved into walls. The keep began to balance strength with a measure of beauty, a reflection of a society slowly emerging from its early turbulence into something more ordered, more self-assured. The keep had begun as a fortress, but it was becoming a symbol of lineage, prestige, and civilization itself. In many ways, the keep represented the medieval dream, the desire to build something unyielding in a world of uncertainty. It was not only about survival, it was about meaning. Every lord who commissioned a keep sought to leave a mark that would endure beyond his death. Every mason who carved stone upon stone contributed to that quiet defiance of time. Even now, the ruins of these keeps stand like monuments to memory, weathered, hollow, and silent, yet still upright. If you walk among them today, the wind will carry faint echoes of tools clinking, of voices calling, of walls being raised not just from earth, but from belief. For to build a keep was to say, I am here, I will not be forgotten. And for centuries, the keeps of Europe have kept that promise. If the keep was the heart of the medieval castle, then the bailey was its body, the living, breathing space where life unfolded, work was done, and the unseen machinery of survival kept the fortress alive. It was here, within the broad courtyards enclosed by high curtain walls, that the pulse of the castle could truly be felt. The bailey was not a single invention, nor the product of one man's vision. It evolved slowly, through need and experience, shaped by every siege survived and every storm endured. The men who built castles learned, one wall at a time, that a fortress was not only a refuge but a system, an ecosystem of stone, timber, and human will. In its earliest form, the bailey was a simple wooden enclosure at the foot of the motte. A fence of sharpened logs, the palisade, marked the boundary between safety and danger. Within it stood huts for soldiers, a small chapel, perhaps a forge, and a storage barn. It was not elegant, but it was functional, a place where the everyday labor of defense could continue. But as castles grew, so too did their walls. The wooden palisades gave way to thick stone curtains, towering walls often 10 or more feet thick, running in long, irregular lines that followed the contours of the land. These walls did more than divide, they defined. They created inner and outer baileys, multiple zones of defense, each designed to hold even if the others fell. A castle was no longer a single structure. It had become a system of layers. Standing before such walls, you might be struck not by their beauty, but by their logic. Every angle, every turn, every projection served a purpose. Curtain walls were rarely straight for long. Builders soon realized that corners and curves could offer overlapping fields of fire, allowing archers to cover each other and protect blind spots. Towers were added at intervals along the wall, projecting outwards so defenders could fire along the base. From above, it was a kind of geometry of survival. Walk along the wall walk, and you would see the crenellations, the alternating pattern of merlons and embrasures, those iconic notches that crowned the top. From behind them, archers could shoot and then step back into cover. Beneath their feet, the walk itself was often lined with wooden hoardings, temporary structures that allowed defenders to drop stones or boiling water directly onto attackers below. It was, in essence, a machine for buying time. Within the bailey, time itself was carefully managed. Here, life was both ordinary and extraordinary. Chickens pecked in the dust near the smithy, smoke drifted from the kitchen's chimney, and children, if there were any within the Lord S. household, played in the narrow patches of sunlight that reached between buildings. The bailey was where the castle's servants lived and worked. Grooms tended horses in the stables, cooks laboured over open fires, and armourers mended dents in mail shirts with steady hands. Every task had its rhythm, every hour its repetition, and above it all, the keep loomed, not oppressive, but constant, like a watchful parent over a busy child. For those who lived here, the castle's hierarchy was not theoretical, it was visible. The lord and lady in the high chambers, the soldiers in the barracks, the servants in the yard. Each space, each wall, mirrored the social order of the world outside. As castles expanded, many developed multiple baileys. The inner bailey was the lord's domain, the safest, most protected area, often containing the keep, great hall, and chapel. Beyond it lay the outer bailey, larger and busier, where most of the work took place: blacksmithing, storage, and the housing of retainers or soldiers. Between them, great gates and drawbridges controlled access, turning the entire complex into a sequence of obstacles. Even if one wall fell, another stood ready. This idea of depth in defense was one of the most remarkable principles of medieval engineering. The castle did not rely on a single strong point. It relied on layers, each designed to exhaust, confuse, and delay the attacker. To breach one wall was merely to begin the struggle anew. The greatest of these curtain-walled fortresses became architectural marvels. Take Dover Castle, perched upon the white cliffs of southern England. Its walls stretch in great concentric rings, enclosing an inner world of stone. Or consider carefully in Wales, its vast water defences reflecting towers upon the moat. In each, the bailey became not just a yard, but a landscape, a miniature city contained within its own defences. From the sentry on the tower to the cook at the hearth, every person inside these walls was part of the same vast, deliberate system of endurance. But for all their strength, the bailey walls were not merely about defence. They were also about display. A castle was a performance of power. The height of its walls, the polish of its gates, the precision of its masonry, all spoke to the wealth and legitimacy of the lord who commanded it. To ride through a castle's gatehouse and into the bailey was to enter a visible hierarchy of stone. Even the smallest detail was calculated to inspire. The smooth ashlar facing of walls, the symmetry of towers, the neat arrangement of the courtyard, all served as a kind of silent declaration. Here stood authority, order, and permanence. For peasants and travellers, the first sight of such a fortress rising above the horizon was both awe and warning. It meant safety, but also control. Life within those walls, however, was not static. Each day began early, with the ringing of a handbell or the call of a steward. Workers emerged from small timber lodgings, carrying tools and buckets. The garrison drilled in the yard. Servants hauled water from wells, and the air filled with the hammering of iron and the bleating of animals. The bailey was a world in miniature, self-contained, yet constantly in motion. By midday, the lord might appear in the great hall, holding court or issuing orders. Messengers rode in and out through the gatehouse, their cloaks dusty from the road. Children of the household were sometimes taught letters by a priest in the chapel, their voices faint beneath the echo of hymns. And when evening came, torches flickered along the walls as the outer gates were barred. The world outside vanished into darkness, and the castle became an island of lamplight, surrounded by silence. It was a life measured not by seasons but by security. The genius of the bailey lay not in its appearance, but in its adaptability. Every castle's walls were different, shaped by geography, resources, and imagination. Some followed rivers, others crowned rocky spurs. Some were almost circular, others sprawling and irregular. Yet all shared a common truth, that defense could be both practical and beautiful. Masons used local stone, adjusting their techniques to its quirks. In limestone regions, walls were smooth and pale. In granite country, rough and dark. Some walls were built with an outer shell of dressed stone and an inner core of rubble and lime, a method called rubble infill that gave immense thickness without wasting fine materials. Even the smallest choices, how high to make a tower, how wide a walkway, reflected years of accumulated wisdom. To walk along a castle wall today is to step into that quiet logic. The stones may be broken, the battlements worn down by wind, but the purpose remains visible. The narrow arrow slits, the corbelled ledges that once supported wooden hoardings, the remnants of staircases leading nowhere, all whisper of the minds that planned them. You can almost feel the weight of centuries beneath your hand, the small chisel marks still visible where a mason once stood, balancing on a scaffold, carving stone by the rhythm of his breath. The bailey was not just an enclosure, it was the visible form of human cooperation. Thousands of lives and labours compressed into a single shape of endurance. And though the wars have long ended, the walls still stand. Not for defense anymore, but as reminders of what humanity once built, not out of peace, but out of the fear of losing it. In time, these curtain walls would grow even more sophisticated, layered upon one another, until they formed concentric systems of defense. Walls within walls, gates within gates. It was a design born from caution, perfected by necessity. But for now, as the age of the simple bailey matured into the age of the great fortress, the castle was becoming something greater than its walls. It was becoming a statement of civilization itself, a proof that order could be carved from chaos and that stone could be made to think. If the keep was the heart and the bailey the body, then the outer defences of a medieval castle were its skin, the first barrier between the order within and the chaos without. Every moat, bridge and gate was part of a carefully designed conversation between safety and danger, between the living and the unknown beyond the walls. To build a fortress was to draw a line against the world, and nowhere was that line more literal or more ingenious than in its outer defences. At first glance, the moat seemed simple, a ditch filled with water. Yet in truth, it was far more than that. In the earliest Motte and bailey castles, moats were nothing more than dry trenches, dug quickly around the wooden palisade. Their purpose was not always to drown attackers, but to delay them, to break the momentum of a charge, to make scaling ladders useless, and to funnel enemies into predictable paths. By the 12th century, as stone walls replaced timber, the moat became deeper and broader. Where natural streams or rivers existed, builders diverted them with hand-dug channels to fill the moat. When there was no nearby water, engineers constructed elaborate drainage systems to maintain even a shallow pool. Water, when still and cold, had its own quiet authority. It mirrored the walls above it, doubled their height in reflection, and made approach both physically and psychologically difficult. Imagine standing before such a moat on a grey morning, the mist curling off its surface, the sound of water lapping against stone, and the realization that beyond it lies not merely a wall but a system of thought, an architecture of control. But water alone was not the moat's only weapon. In many fortresses, the moat was lined with sharp stakes beneath the surface, hidden defences designed to impale or trap anyone who tried to wade through. In winter, frozen moats presented a new danger. They could give the illusion of safety, but the ice was often deliberately weakened near the centre, cracking under the weight of attackers. In others, the moat was dry, but just as dangerous. These dry moats or ditches were often steep-sided and lined with loose gravel or clay, making them nearly impossible to climb quickly. The ground below might be littered with caltrops, small four-spiked iron devices that always landed with one point upward. Even when empty of water, the moat remained an obstacle of cunning simplicity. Across this boundary stretched the bridge, the fragile thread connecting the castle to the world beyond. In the early days, this bridge was fixed, a permanent timber structure spanning the moat, but as attackers grew more inventive, so did defenders. Soon came the drawbridge, a marvel of medieval mechanics. The drawbridge was both door and weapon. It could be raised in moments, cutting off all entry, and lowered again with careful balance. The mechanism was usually housed within the gatehouse itself, operated by a system of chains, pulleys, and counterweights. When raised, the bridge became a wall, its wooden underside reinforced with iron plates to withstand rams or fire. When lowered, it reconnected the castle to its lands, allowing trade, travel, and life to flow in once more. There was poetry in its motion, the slow creak of timber, the clink of iron, and the echo of boots across planks. It was not merely a mechanism of defense, it was the castle's heartbeat, opening and closing in rhythm with the day. The gatehouse, through which the bridge led, was perhaps the most intricate of all the outer defences. It was a structure of paradox, both welcoming and forbidding. Its archway framed the passage between freedom and safety, yet its design ensured that entry was never guaranteed. Above the gateway hung the Portcullis, a heavy lattice of oak and iron, sliding vertically in grooves cut into the stone. A single lever or rope could release it, letting it crash down with bone-breaking speed. The spikes at its base dug into the ground, sealing the entry like a set of iron teeth. Inside, a passage wound through thick walls, narrow enough to prevent a group from rushing through at once. From above, hidden chambers known as murder holes allowed defenders to drop stones, boiling oil, or sand upon intruders trapped below. On either side, crossbowmen could shoot through narrow slits, their targets visible but helpless. To pass through such a gatehouse was to step into a machine designed to kill slowly. And yet, when peace prevailed, that same passage became a stage for ceremony, processions, arrivals, and the comings and goings of daily life. Every castle's gatehouse carried that dual identity, part battlefield, part threshold. Beyond the gate and moat, the barbican stood, an outwork, a kind of stone trap. The barbican was a fortified extension of the gatehouse, a walled courtyard that forced attackers into a narrow, exposed space before they could even reach the main entrance. It was often connected by a short bridge or tunnel, its walls lined with arrow slits and guard towers. From here, defenders could pour fire upon enemies who thought they had already reached the gates. Some barbicans had false doors or deceptive corners, designed to mislead or trap the unwary. In some castles, like the great fortress of Carcassonne in France, the barbican stretched outward in complex, zigzagging paths, forcing attackers to move under continuous observation and fire. It was not strength alone that made such defenses effective, but psychology. To assault a castle was to endure not only weapons, but uncertainty, the sense that every step forward might be your last. The genius of the outer defenses lay in their unity. No moat stood alone. No gatehouse worked without its portcullis, bridge, or barbican. The entire system functioned like the gears of a clock, precise, interlocking, and deliberate. Each element complemented the others, creating what engineers today might call defense in depth. An enemy who overcame one obstacle found themselves confronted by another, and another, each narrower, deadlier, and more exhausting than the last. This was the true art of castle design. Not the raw thickness of stone, but the time it could steal from an attacker. Every minute delayed meant another chance for relief to arrive, another arrow to be loosed, another night endured. A castle did not need to be invincible, only impossible to conquer quickly. When peace returned, the same features took on gentler roles. The moat became reflective, a tranquil mirror for the clouds. Ducks and swans floated on its surface, and children of the castle household might toss bread from the bridge. The drawbridge creaked open not to soldiers, but to merchants, pilgrims, and guests. Even the gatehouse found new rhythms, guards greeting travellers, servants sweeping the entrance, dogs lounging in the sun. It was a strange duality, the tools of death now serving life. And so, through decades and centuries, the moat and bridge endured not only as barriers, but as symbols of boundaries respected, of order maintained. The castle, once a weapon of war, was also a keeper of peace, a visible assurance that the world inside was safe, at least for now. Even today, when you walk along the remnants of a moat or pass beneath a weathered gatehouse, you can sense the deliberate intelligence behind their design. The grooves in the stone where the portcullis once slid, the iron hinges that held the drawbridge chains, the quiet symmetry of the entrance, all whisper of minds that worked in logic, not in haste. Every inch was calculated. Every feature was a response, not to beauty, but to fear. And yet in that fear, there was brilliance. For through necessity, the builders of medieval Europe discovered something extraordinary, that defense could be both functional and magnificent, that protection could also be art. The moat and the bridge, the gate and the barbican, they were not just obstacles, but statements. Together they declared, "Here ends the wilderness, here begins the world of stone." In time, these defenses would evolve yet again. The simple gatehouse would become an elaborate fortress of its own, with towers, courtyards, and trap passages. But within those walls, another transformation was quietly unfolding, one that would turn the castle from fortress to community. Inside the gates, behind the moat, daily life continued, small, ordered, and human. And that is where we will go next. You stand now at the very threshold of the medieval castle, a place both ordinary and extraordinary, a narrow passage where the outside world met the fortress's inner life. It is the Gatehouse, the deliberate choke point, the architectural handshake between the chaos beyond and the ordered world within. Every visitor, every messenger, every cart of grain, every army had to pass through it. And because of that, the Gatehouse became one of the most carefully designed and symbolically loaded spaces in all of castle architecture. The earliest fortifications, those timber and earth mottes and baileys, had simple gates, a wooden door, perhaps with a watchtower above it. But as the 12th century rolled forward and as stone replaced wood, the Gatehouse evolved into a structure of remarkable complexity and quiet menace. You can picture it. A stone archway pierced straight through the thick curtain wall, flanked by two tall towers that seem to lean slightly forward, like shoulders bracing against the weight of the world. The air inside the passage feels cooler, echoing with the faint drip of water and the creak of heavy iron hinges. A traveller arriving at such a gate would first encounter the outer doors, solid oak thickened with iron straps. But those doors were merely the beginning. Beyond them lay a tunnel of stone, sometimes straight, sometimes slightly angled, designed with a cruel sort of intelligence. Slits in the walls allowed defenders to rain arrows or boiling water on anyone trapped inside. Above, hidden galleries called murder holes could open to the sky, through which hot sand, stones, or pitch could be poured down upon intruders. And then there was the Portcullis, that famous iron-toothed grid that could be dropped from above at a moment's notice. Contrary to what later storytellers imagined, the Portcullis was not always metal. In earlier centuries, it was often made of thick timber bound with iron, sliding in deep vertical grooves. It could be raised by chains wound around a windlass in the chamber above. The moment of its descent would have been terrifying, the iron crashing down, echoing through the gate tunnel like thunder. Once lowered, the Portcullis could not easily be forced, for its very weight pressed it tight into the stone floor. Behind it stood yet another set of doors, sometimes even a second Portcullis, so that an enemy who somehow breached the first barrier would find themselves trapped in a deadly cage, a space between two gates surrounded by murder holes and arrow loops. Some gatehouses had small postern doors, secret side exits used by defenders for surprise attacks or for slipping messengers out under cover of darkness. For the castle's residents, however, the gatehouse was more than just a defense mechanism. It was a statement of authority. The Lord's emblem might be carved above the arch. His banner might flutter from the battlements. The heavy iron doors, the sound of the portcullis chain, all of it reminded those who entered that they were stepping into someone's domain. In later centuries, gatehouses even became semi-residential, with guardrooms, chapels, and comfortable chambers above the gate tunnel. A visitor waiting for permission to enter might smell the smoke from the garrison's hearth, or hear the clatter of dishes from within. Inside the gatehouse, every inch was calculated for both control and communication. Narrow windows gave limited views of the outer road, allowing guards to assess a traveller's purpose before opening the doors. Iron grills permitted talk without risk. Even the paving stones beneath your feet were designed with slope and drainage in mind, to prevent attackers from flooding the entrance with flammable liquids or to guide rainwater away from the door's base. One could almost say that the gatehouse was the brain of the castle's defences, the point where intelligence, strategy, and power all converged. From here, the guards could control entry, monitor the walls, and sound alarms. In many castles, the gatehouse overlooked the most vulnerable side, often facing the approach road, where siege engines or battering rams would be rolled into place. To defend against that, the flanking towers were equipped with crossbow slits at different angles, giving overlapping fields of fire. The beauty of the gatehouse, however, was not only in its strength, but in its psychology. It made an impression before a single arrow was fired. For a peasant bringing grain, or a merchant hoping for trade, it was a reminder of order and security. For an enemy, it was a message of futility, a wall of stone and shadow, a narrow throat impossible to swallow. In the 13th and 14th centuries, as castle building reached its zenith, the gatehouse became ever more elaborate. Some English examples, like those at Caerphilly or Beaumaris, featured twin drum towers linked by heavy machicolations, open stone galleries through which defenders could drop projectiles directly downward. The gatehouse of Conwy Castle, by contrast, was compact and efficient, its portcullis grooves still visible after 7 centuries. Each region developed its own subtle variations, reflecting the balance between local threats, available materials, and the ambitions of the lord. But the essence remained the same: the art of controlled entry. Everything about the gatehouse spoke of measured access, of decisions made between welcome and rejection. It was the line between hospitality and hostility, between peace and siege. And yet, for all its ingenuity, the gatehouse also tells us something more subtle about medieval life. The world outside those walls was unpredictable, filled with war, wandering strangers, and uncertainty. The gatehouse was the filter that allowed the castle to breathe without being consumed. You can almost imagine standing there, as a traveller might have, beneath the shadow of the portcullis. The guard peers down from above, his voice echoing against the stone. You state your purpose, your name, perhaps hand over a letter sealed in wax. The air is heavy with the scent of iron and damp earth. For a moment you wait, uncertain whether the chain will lift, whether the gate will open. And in that pause, between entry and denial, you can feel the full weight of what a castle was meant to be, a place where power decided who may pass and who must remain outside. Yet beyond this gate lies not only safety, but another world entirely. One of winding passages, narrow stairs, and silent inner courts where life unfolded in measured rhythms. Because once you passed the gatehouse, you were no longer a visitor. You were inside. But what awaited those within the walls? The rhythms of daily life, the hierarchy, the work, and the silence. How did the castle function once its gates were closed? That story begins, quietly, in the next section. You have stepped through the gatehouse, past the iron portcullis and the deep echo of its chains, into the quiet world inside the castle walls. The air changes here. It feels contained, almost still, as though the thick stones absorb not only sound, but time itself. Within these enclosures, life was not measured by seasons of battle or moments of drama, but by repetition, habit, and endurance. To live inside a castle was to live by order, an intricate system of hierarchy, labor, and ritual that made survival possible. The first thing you would notice, standing in the inner courtyard or bailey, is how practical everything seems. Every structure has a purpose, and each purpose supports another. The well at the center is the heart of life. It must never fail. Water, drawn by rope and bucket, sustains the kitchens, the horses, the garrison, the chapel. Around it, small workshops cling to the base of the curtain walls. The blacksmith's forge, the bakehouse, the brewhouse, the carpenter's shed. Each one hums with quiet labor, and the smell of heat, grain, and wood smoke hangs in the still air. Early in the morning, before the first light fully touches the battlements, movement begins. The guards change watch on the towers, stamping their feet against the cold. A kitchen boy hauls water from the well, slipping on frost. A cook stirs the embers in the long hearth, coaxing yesterday's fire back to life. Bread dough, left to rise in the night, is baked into hard brown loaves. Heavy, durable, meant to last. In the stables, grooms check the horses' hooves, brushing out mud and straw. And somewhere above, in the Lord's private chamber, a servant opens wooden shutters to a grey dawn. This was not a place of constant excitement or luxury. Most of the time, it was routine, a kind of small-scale civilization sustained by discipline and habit. Even the smallest castle might house 30 or 40 people, a large one, hundreds. Each person had a defined role: the cook, the laundress, the stable master, the falconer, the porter, the chaplain. They lived in close proximity, their work overlapping like threads in a woven cloth. At the top of this hierarchy stood the lord and lady, the castle's masters. Their lives, though more comfortable than others, were also bound by structure. The lord's duties were managerial as much as martial. He oversaw rents, justice, and supplies. His mornings were often spent at a wooden table covered in scrolls, where he would listen to petitions from tenants or issue orders to his steward. The lady, meanwhile, directed the domestic world, managing stores of grain and ale, assigning servants their tasks, and tending to the sick within the walls. In her chamber, a small brazier glowed beside embroidered hangings, a flicker of warmth in a building that was otherwise built for endurance, not comfort. Below them were the men-at-arms, professional soldiers and retainers who lived within the castle year-round. They trained in the yard, repaired armour, cleaned weapons, and drilled in formation under the watchful eye of the constable. Their lodgings were simple, long rooms with wooden bunks and straw mattresses, but they were the castle's backbone, ready to man the walls at a moment's notice. Further down the ladder were the servants and labourers. They kept the castle functioning, unseen but indispensable. The kitchen staff baked, brewed, salted meat, and prepared pottage, a thick stew of barley, peas, and whatever vegetables could be grown in the small garden plots near the walls. The laundresses worked by the well, their hands raw from cold water. The grooms cared for the horses, feeding them hay and oats hauled in by cart from nearby fields. And in the dim lower halls, where the air smelled of damp stone and smoke, the cellarer managed food stores with mathematical precision. Grain was counted by bushels, ale by barrels. In times of siege, those stores might mean the difference between life and death. Bread was baked daily, but salt pork, dried beans, and smoked fish could be kept for months. Nothing was wasted. The rhythm of the day followed the church bell, not the clock. At dawn, the chapel bell called to matins, the morning prayer. Even the soldiers paused, removing their helmets and bowing their heads. The priest's voice echoed off cold stone, a murmured reminder of order amid uncertainty. After matins came work, then the midday meal. Simple but sustaining. Evening prayers marked the close of daylight, after which torches were lit and gates secured. In this contained world, every sound carried meaning. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the call of the porter at the gate, the barking of dogs in the kennel, each was part of the castle's pulse. To live here was to be aware of everything, even silence. When the courtyard fell quiet, it was not peace but readiness, the stillness before movement. For children of the household, sons of knights or servants alike, the castle was a school of endurance. Pages learned courtesy, Latin, and the art of waiting. Squires learned discipline through service, cleaning armour, tending horses, watching their masters at table. They dreamed of knighthood, though the reality of it was often far less glorious than the songs implied. At night, when the wind pressed against the shutters and the torches guttered in the passageways, the castle settled into its slow breathing. Guards walked the parapets in pairs, their footsteps muffled by the snow. Dogs lay near the hearth. Somewhere in the upper chambers, the Lord's scribe bent over parchment, copying letters by candlelight. The ink froze sometimes, thickening like syrup. He would warm it between his hands before continuing. Despite the rigid hierarchy, life within the castle walls was a form of collective survival. Everyone depended on everyone else. The mason needed the blacksmith's tools. The blacksmith needed food from the kitchen needed water from the well, and the well needed guards to protect it. The entire system was interlocked, just like the stones themselves. But this sense of order could be easily shattered. A bad harvest, a failed well, a siege. Any one of these could throw the castle's careful rhythm into chaos. Supplies that once seemed abundant might run out within weeks. Fires might spread through wooden roofs. Disease could slip silently through the gates. Still, the people endured. That was the quiet miracle of these places. Not the battles or banners, but the simple persistence of daily life, year after year, through cold and hunger and fear. When morning came, the gate would open again, the drawbridge would lower, and trade would resume. Messengers would come and go, carts would roll through the gatehouse, and the pattern would begin anew. Inside, life was slow, measured, and deliberate, a kind of human rhythm built to last as long as the stones themselves. Yet even here, behind the thickest walls, time was changing. New ideas were rising, of comfort, of prestige, of design. Castles were no longer only for defense. They were becoming symbols of power and residence, where strength met elegance. And so, the next transformation would come not from war, but from ambition. Because when safety was secured, attention turned to beauty. By the late 12th and 13th centuries, castles had grown beyond their first purpose. What began as fortresses of necessity, places built for defense, isolation, and survival, began slowly to transform into something else. Homes, symbols of status, and carefully curated statements of power. The evolution was gradual, but steady, as the rhythms of war gave way, at least for a time, to the rhythms of governance and domestic life. To walk through such a castle in this era was to see an architecture of duality. The same stones that had once withstood siege now also supported chambers hung with tapestries. A spiral stair that once led to a fighting platform might now lead to a private solar, warmed by a small fireplace and lit by narrow glazed windows. The moat remained, but it was now crossed daily by merchants, musicians, and courtiers, rather than by soldiers bearing spears. The castle had become a performance, a stage upon which the lord could demonstrate not only his might, but his refinement. And yet, even in its comfort, the architecture never forgot its origins. Every corner, every hall, every threshold still held the memory of defense. You can picture a typical great castle of the 13th century, perhaps Conisbrough, or Chateau Gaillard, or Kenilworth, standing on its hill, encircled by curtain walls that gleam pale in the sun. The outer walls still bear arrow slits, but within them lies a second world. Carefully paved courtyards, neatly tended gardens, chambers filled with light. The Lord's residence has expanded, a great hall, a private solar, chambers for guests, and small rooms for servants and clerks. The air inside smells faintly of wax, wood smoke, and lavender. The great hall was the true heart of this transformation. Once a purely functional gathering space for meals, it became the architectural centerpiece, long, lofty, and open, with a high timber roof and banners hanging from its beams. Here, the Lord would dine publicly, surrounded by retainers, musicians, and visiting dignitaries. At one end, upon a slightly raised platform known as the dais, stood the Lord's table, flanked by carved chairs. From this position, he could see and be seen, both ruler and host. Meals were as much about display as sustenance. Roasted swan, venison, or peacock might appear on silver dishes, more for show than taste. Minstrels performed songs recounting family lineage or heroic deeds. Guests were impressed not just by abundance, but by order, the smooth coordination of servants, the shining armor displayed on the walls, the carved heraldry on the ceiling beams. Everything spoke of hierarchy and discipline, yet also of refinement. But beyond the noise of the great hall lay another, more private world. The solar, the Lord's chamber of retreat. Here, the tone softened. Walls were covered in tapestries, not only for beauty, but to trap warmth against the chill of stone. The hearth burned through the evening, the firelight flickering across embroidered cushions and chests. Windows, though still narrow, now held glass, a rare luxury, coloured faintly green or yellow. For the first time in centuries, sunlight could enter without cold wind following it. In such rooms, The lord and lady might read, write letters, or receive close friends. The presence of books, musical instruments, and writing desks marked a subtle shift. Castles were not only strongholds of war, but centers of culture and administration. The steward and clerks worked nearby, copying records and keeping account books that tracked rents, tithes, and supplies. For the lady of the castle, these private chambers were both domain and duty. She oversaw domestic affairs from here, the management of servants, the storage of provisions, the welfare of guests. In wealthier households, she might preside over embroidery, reading, or the instruction of young girls in manners and letters. The gentle hum of this life, the creak of spinning wheels, the crackle of fire, the murmur of prayer, gave the castle a softer rhythm. Even comfort, however, came wrapped in practicality. The fireplaces that warmed the solar also smoked. The rushes on the floor needed regular replacement. Sanitation was primitive. Garderobes, or latrines, built into the thickness of the walls and emptying through chutes into the moat below. The scents of life were everywhere. Wax and wool, tallow and ale, wet dogs, burning peat, human breath. Yet for all this, there was a beauty in how these places balanced hardness with humanity. The castle remained, above all, a machine for living in uncertain times. But now it also expressed pride, legacy, and identity. Carved doorways bore the Lord's coat of arms. Chapels glittered with small stained glass windows depicting saints and family patrons. Stone masons signed their work in hidden marks, and sculpted grotesques watched silently from the parapets. The castle garden also began to appear during this age of prestige. Small enclosed spaces within the inner bailey, planted with herbs, flowers, and fruit trees. These were not grand displays of wealth like later Renaissance gardens, but rather quiet refuges. Monks' knowledge of plants found new purpose here. Mint for stomach ailments, sage for cleansing, lavender for scenting linens. It was a small oasis within the fortress, a place where one might pause, listen to bees, and look out across the fields below. As architecture matured, comfort merged with artistry. Decorative stonework, known as tracery, began to appear in windows and archways. Ceilings were painted with stars. Floors, once bare, were laid with tiles bearing geometric designs or family emblems. Even stairways became deliberate expressions of symbolism, winding clockwise so that a right-handed defender held the advantage against an attacker climbing upward. The logic of war and the language of beauty had become one and the same. This blending of strength and sophistication created what might be called the golden age of the medieval castle, when form and function achieved their most delicate balance. To stand in one was to witness centuries of adaptation, from wooden fort to stone citadel, from citadel to home. Still, every luxury came at a cost. The resources required to maintain such households were vast. Dozens of servants, herds of cattle, endless firewood, and constant repairs to stone and timber. The castle was not a static monument. It was a living thing, consuming labor and time. A neglected wall could crumble. A dry well could spell disaster. Behind the elegance lay constant vigilance. And outside those high walls, the world was shifting. Trade was growing, towns were rising, and the very idea of power was expanding beyond the castle's reach. Wealth was no longer measured solely in land or stone, but in coin, cloth, and commerce. Within the castle, tapestries softened walls that had once echoed with the clash of steel. Beyond it, the first hints of a changing age could be heard. The markets, the guilds, the hum of cities. And yet, inside the great hall, the fire still burned. The banners still hung motionless in the air. The castle, though evolving, still held its ancient purpose, to endure. But soon, new tools would emerge. Tools that no wall, no matter how thick, could withstand. The age of gunpowder was approaching, and with it, the beginning of the castle's decline. It began, as many revolutions do, quietly, with smoke, confusion, and disbelief. At first the sound was strange, more like a storm than a weapon. But soon it grew unmistakable, a deep, percussive thunder that rolled across battlefields and echoed against stone. The age of the castle, long defined by the strength of walls and the courage of men behind them, was coming to an end, undone not by betrayal or neglect, but by the chemistry of fire and metal. Gunpowder had been known in Europe since the 13th century, a curiosity brought westward through the slow channels of trade and translation. Early experiments were crude, mixtures of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that sometimes exploded too soon or not at all. But as alchemists and engineers learned its temperament, gunpowder began to change everything it touched. At first, it was used in celebration, for fireworks, pageants, and royal displays. Then came its adaptation to war. Small cannon, called bombards, appeared in the arsenals of kings and dukes. These early weapons were clumsy, expensive, and dangerous even to their users. They fired stone balls that shattered against walls rather than piercing them. Yet even these primitive guns carried a strange new power, the ability to terrify. Imagine standing atop a castle wall in the mid-14th century, looking down as one of these bombards was wheeled into place by a besieging army. The air smells of damp earth and smoke. A team of men loads powder and ball into a bronze barrel braced with wooden beams. They light a fuse. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a flash, a shockwave, and a roar that rolls through your chest. A ball of stone, blackened with soot, crashes into the base of the wall. The stone holds, but it trembles. A new kind of fear takes root. The defenders adapt at first, as they always have. They thicken the lower walls, fill in old arrow slits, and build earthen banks to absorb impact. But the guns grow stronger. Metal replaces stone in the cannon's barrel. The projectiles change from round stone to forged iron, smaller, denser, and devastating. What once took weeks of siege engines to accomplish can now be done in hours. By the early 15th century, the mathematics of defense no longer favored the castle. Walls that once symbolized eternity could now be cracked open by a handful of cannon. The proud towers, tall, elegant, and thin, became liabilities. Their height invited destruction. The old idea of defense through elevation was replaced by defense through absorption. Low, thick, sloped walls designed to deflect, not resist. In France, Burgundy, and the Italian states, engineers began to rethink fortification entirely. The bastion, a projecting wedge of earth and stone, emerged as the new model, a geometry designed for the gun age. It was the first whisper of the modern fortress, flat and angular, rather than vertical and proud. But in England, and much of northern Europe, the transformation came more slowly. Many lords clung to their castles, patching walls, lowering towers, widening moats. For a time, the old and new coexisted. Longbows beside cannon, knights beside gunners. Yet the writing was carved deep into the very stone. The world of the sword was giving way to the world of powder. Still, for a while, life within the castle continued much as before. Lords held court, feasted, administered justice. The gatehouses still stood. The great halls still glowed with firelight. But the thunder outside grew louder. The Wars of the Roses in England, the 100 Years' War in France. These conflicts proved that no wall, however ancient, could stand forever against organized artillery. Some castles were rebuilt with gun ports and rounded towers, orilons, designed to mount small cannons for defense. But it was a losing struggle. The economics of power were shifting. It was no longer sensible to invest fortunes in walls that could be broken, nor to live in isolated strongholds far from trade and politics. The nobility began to move, first cautiously, then decisively, into manor houses, palaces, and town residences, where wealth could be displayed through comfort, not defense. The very symbols of status changed. Once, a man's power was shown by his keep. Now it was by his gardens, his galleries, his libraries. The castle, once the beating heart of feudal life, became a relic of an older rhythm, one of mud, iron, and endurance. By the late 15th century, the evidence was undeniable. At the siege of Roxburgh in 1460, a Scottish cannon exploded and killed the king himself. At Castillon, French artillery annihilated the English army and ended the 100 Years' War. In Italy, city walls were reshaped in earth and brick to survive bombardment. The medieval world, with its chivalry, its moats, its towers, was fading beneath the smoke. But though gunpowder destroyed castles as fortresses, it also immortalized them. The very act of their ruin made them sacred. Lords abandoned their keeps, but poets, painters, and travelers began to see them in a new light, not as symbols of power, but as ruins of memory. The broken walls became monuments to an age when defense was built by hand, stone by stone, in faith that it would last forever. If you walk through those ruins today, through crumbling arches, stairways that lead nowhere, and windows open to the wind, you can still sense the quiet intelligence of their design. The stones may be cracked, but the logic remains. Every corner, every stair, every slit and vault was placed with purpose. The thunder of cannon silenced their walls, but not their meaning. And so, the end of the castle was not truly an ending, but a transformation. From machines of war, they became machines of memory, standing reminders of a world that believed, perhaps naively, in permanence. Yet for those who once lived within them, the shift was disorienting. A castle was not only a home or a fortress, it was an entire way of thinking about safety, power, and order. When the sound of thunder came, it shook more than stone. It shook the foundation of feudal life itself. What would follow would be a world less isolated, more connected, and, in time, more dangerous in its reach. The castle had taught Europe the art of defense. The new age would teach it the art of expansion. The walls had fallen outward, and beyond them stretched a world ready to be claimed. The thunder of cannon faded, but its echo lingered. Not in the air, but in the way people began to think about their homes, their power, and their place in the world. The old castle, once a symbol of strength and dominion, now stood awkwardly in a new era that no longer needed high walls or deep moats. It was not war that shaped the next generation of buildings, but peace, or at least the hope of it. As the 15th century gave way to the 16th, the landscape of Europe began to soften. Where once battlements had crowned every ridge and river bend, now gardens spread, fields widened, and windows opened to the light. A new kind of architecture emerged, not born from fear, but from confidence. It was the manor house, the country seat, the gentle successor to the fortress. The story of this transformation begins with a question. What happens when safety is no longer something you must build, but something you assume? For centuries, the castle's architecture had been shaped by the threat of siege. Every wall, gate, and stair was designed with survival in mind. But in the later 1400s, that threat receded. Strong monarchies replaced feuding barons. Gunpowder had shifted the balance of power away from private armies towards centralized states. And with peace, at least within the borders of a kingdom, came a new kind of ambition, the desire to live beautifully. In England, France, and across the Low Countries, lords who had once commanded garrisons began to commission homes that were less about defense and more about display. The Motte and bailey became the manor and garden. The moat, once filled with brackish water and refuse, became a reflective pond, decorative, serene. Arrow slits widened into mullioned windows that poured sunlight into rooms once kept deliberately dim. The hall, that great communal space where soldiers and servants once dined together, evolved too. It became an expression of hospitality rather than hierarchy. Its hearth no longer a symbol of survival, but of warmth and civility. Above it, private chambers expanded, staircases became grander, and ceilings rose high with carved beams and painted plaster. And the kitchens, once smoky, stone-floored caverns designed for feeding armies, transformed into organized centers of domestic life. The new country houses were less like fortresses and more like small, self-contained worlds, run with precision by stewards and servants rather than soldiers. The change was not merely practical, it was philosophical. The castle had been an instrument of power through control. The manor was an instrument of power through culture. A lord no longer proved his importance by how well he could withstand a siege, but by how graciously he could host a guest. Books, tapestries, and music became the new ornaments of rank. This shift was mirrored across Europe. In France, the once militarized chateaux of the Loire Valley blossomed into architectural marvels like Chambord, Chenonceau, and Azay-le-Rideau, palaces of pleasure where towers still stood, but only as decoration. Their battlements were carved lacework, their moats reflected beauty rather than fear. In Italy, the villas of Tuscany and Lombardy blended symmetry, proportion, and perspective. Ideas born from the rediscovery of ancient Rome. Even in England, where the medieval spirit clung longest, the New Age could not be resisted. Henry VI's reign saw the rise of prodigy houses, sprawling symmetrical estates like Hampton Court and Longleat, built not to repel armies, but to impress courtiers. Architects studied Vitruvius instead of fortification manuals. Defense had become design. And yet, the manor carried something of the old castle within it, not in its walls, but in its soul. The instinct to command, to oversee, to organize life from a central seat that remained. The manor was the castle reborn, not as a bastion of war, but as a theatre of order. The lord still ruled, but his rule was now expressed through landscape, architecture, and routine. Beyond the manor's doors, the estate became its own kind of fortress, not of stone, but of space. Parklands, fields, and villages formed concentric rings of influence, like the baileys of an invisible castle. Peasants became tenants, garrisons became gardeners, and the rhythms of feudalism faded into those of estate management. Inside, a new etiquette took hold. Silence in the halls, deference in the corridors, meals served according to rank and ritual. The clang of armor gave way to the rustle of silk. Where once a watchman had stood on the tower, now a servant waited at the stair. And through these halls drifted a new kind of sound, the faint notes of the lute, the murmur of reading, the laughter of guests. These were the harmonies of peace, delicate and deliberate, built upon the ruins of war. Still, not all castles vanished. Many were simply converted, their towers cut down, their halls rebuilt, their moats drained. The shell of the fortress endured, but its meaning changed. Some became abbeys, others country estates, others mere romantic ruins, haunted by memory, admired by poets, visited by travellers. By the 17th century, the transformation was complete. The great country house stood where the castle once ruled, a statement not of survival, but of refinement. Stone no longer meant defense, it meant dignity. Architecture no longer served fear, but taste. And yet, for all their grace and symmetry, these manors still whispered the old language of fortification. In their gated courtyards, in their walled gardens, in the alignment of their roads and avenues, you can still see the faint echo of medieval order. The instinct to shape the world into safety, to define the boundary between what is ours and what is beyond, never truly disappeared. It only evolved. The castle had not died. It had simply changed its costume. Beneath the plaster and polish of the country house, the old bones of feudal power still rested quietly, smoothed by time, but never gone. Because in the end, the castle was never just a building, it was an idea. And ideas, unlike stone, are not easily destroyed. By the time the 18th century dawned, the true age of castles was long past. Their walls had grown cold, their moats stilled, their towers half swallowed by ivy and time. Yet, in a strange and quiet way, the castle had never been more alive, not in reality, but in imagination. What once stood as a fortress of authority now lingered as a symbol, a shape in the collective memory of Europe that refused to fade. The great keeps that had once dominated landscapes now dominated paintings, poems, and stories. Where their original builders had once sought defense, later generations found romance. The ruin became beautiful precisely because it was broken. The crack in the tower, the shattered gate, the lichen climbing the battlements, all spoke of something ancient, something lost. In those fragments of stone, people began to see not power, but mystery. The 18th century's fascination with the past, with its ruins, its echoes, its melancholy grandeur, was more than nostalgia. It was a cultural rediscovery of the castle as symbol, as a vessel for memory itself. Travelers and writers wandered through old fortresses, sketching their crumbling outlines and writing of their faded glory. The ruins of Tintagel, Kenilworth, Bodiam, and Chillon were visited not for their strength, but for their silence. In England, poets like Thomas Gray and William Wordsworth turned ruined castles into metaphors for the passage of time. Painters such as J.M.W. Turner filled their canvases with towers half hidden in mist and twilight. What had once been an emblem of feudal dominance was now a stage upon which nature performed its slow reclamation. It is here that the castle crossed from history into myth. The ruins stirred something deeper than architectural curiosity. They awakened the old stories that had always clung to these stones. Tales of lost kings, captive princesses, brave knights, and ghosts who wandered battlements at dusk. Every broken wall seemed to whisper of battles fought, loves lost, and oaths forgotten. The castle in myth had always been a living thing. Long before historians recorded its dimensions or masons inscribed their marks, storytellers had filled these places with meaning. To the medieval imagination, castles were not just homes or defenses. They were boundaries between worlds. Inside, order, law, and loyalty. Outside, chaos, danger, and the wild. And at the gates, always, a threshold, guarded by stone and by story. Think of the legends of Arthurian Britain, the gleaming towers of Camelot, the mysterious fortress of Dolorous Gard, or the enchanted halls of the Fisher King. Each reflects an echo of real castles, filtered through centuries of imagination. In these stories, walls did not merely protect, they contained magic, honor, and destiny. The castle was not built from stone alone, but from belief. In Germany, the same spirit took root in the Romantic revival of the 19th century. The Middle Ages, once dismissed as dark and barbaric, became a source of inspiration and national pride. The fairy tale silhouette of Neuschwanstein, built by King Ludwig II of Bavaria in the late 1800s, was less a fortress than a dream made visible, an idealized vision of medieval chivalry rendered in white stone. It was no accident that, centuries later, its image would inspire the Disney castle, itself a symbol of imagination and fantasy. The medieval fortress, reborn through art and myth, had found immortality in the modern world's dreamscape. But behind the fairy tales and paintings, the deeper symbolism of the castle endured. It remained a reflection of human longing, for safety, for permanence, for meaning. The towering walls stood as metaphors for the boundaries we build around ourselves, both to protect and to imprison. The high windows that once looked out over battlefields now seem to look inward, into memory itself. As empires rose and fell, the castle remained, not in armies or architecture, but in the imagination. It appeared in literature, from Walter Scott's romanticized historical novels to the Gothic towers of Mary Shelley and Bram Stoker. Each author reshaped the castle into something new, a haunted ruin, a prison of the mind, a vessel of secrets. In the Gothic imagination, the castle became a place where time stood still, where the past lingered too long and ghosts refused to leave. It was no longer the home of lords, but of shadows, the once celebrated features of its design. Narrow corridors, twisting staircases, hidden chambers, became perfect metaphors for human fear and obsession. And yet, even in its most haunted form, the castle retained its dignity. The stories of Dracula's fortress or the lonely keep in the mysteries of Udolpho were not merely tales of horror. They were meditations on memory, on how the past, like a castle, is always standing just behind us, silent and indestructible. Even today, the castle's image persists everywhere. It crowns tourist brochures, children's storybooks, and national flags. It lives in films, games, and architecture both real and imagined. It is a shape we all recognize. A few towers, a gate, a crown of battlements. And yet it means something slightly different to everyone who sees it. To some, it is adventure. To others, melancholy. To others still, safety. But perhaps the most remarkable thing is that the castle's symbolic life has lasted longer than its practical one. The age of the fortress lasted perhaps 500 years. Its image, though, has endured for twice that and shows no sign of fading. Why? Perhaps because the castle speaks to something fundamental in the human heart, the tension between defense and openness, between solitude and belonging. To build a wall is to define oneself, and to live behind it is to remember both what we have built and what we have lost. The stones that once echoed with the clang of armor now echo with footsteps of tourists, whispers of wind, and the click of cameras. Yet the feeling remains the same, that quiet awe when you stand beneath a high wall and look up, realizing that someone, long ago, imagined this shape as protection, and that we, centuries later, still find it beautiful. The genius of the medieval castle, it seems, was not only in its engineering, but in its endurance, not just of its walls, but of its meaning. And as the centuries turned, that meaning continued to evolve. For the castle, ever adaptable, had one final transformation ahead, from the symbol of power to the object of preservation. By the dawn of the 19th century, the castle had become something more than a relic. It was a riddle that the modern world could not stop trying to solve. Once a living engine of feudal power, it now stood as a ruin, half devoured by ivy, weather, and time. Yet rather than being forgotten, these remnants of stone were rediscovered, reimagined, and even rebuilt. The age of fortification had passed, but the age of preservation had quietly begun. To understand this transformation, imagine walking through Britain or France around the year 1820. In the countryside, the outlines of old castles were everywhere. Grey towers rising from misty hills, shattered gatehouses beside slow rivers, broken curtain walls standing like the ribs of ancient beasts. For centuries, they had been part of the landscape, ignored or mined for stone by nearby farmers. But now, something changed. The Romantic movement, with its passion for the past and its longing for lost grandeur, had turned ruins into monuments. The same walls that once symbolized oppression now stirred feelings of melancholy and wonder. Writers, artists, and philosophers began to speak of the beauty of decay, of how ruins held a poetry all their own. The French painter Hubert Robert, known as Robert des Ruines, filled his canvases with imaginary castles in collapse, sunlight streaming through fallen arches. In England, Sir Walter Scott A.S. novels, especially Ivanhoe and The Bride of Lammermoor, revived interest in medieval life, transforming old fortresses into backdrops for romance and heroism. Tourists began to seek out these places, travelling by coach to see Warwick, Alnwick, Arundel, and Conwy, each half ruin and half memory. And then came the restorers. By the mid-19th century, a new kind of fascination emerged, not just with how castles looked, but with what they had been. Across Europe, governments and private patrons began to take an active interest in protecting and restoring these monuments. In Britain, the Office of Works began cataloguing and maintaining historic buildings. In France, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc, an architect with both imagination and audacity, led extensive restorations of castles and cathedrals, among them Carcassonne, Pierrefonds, and Chinon. Viollet-le-Duc did not merely repair castles, he reimagined them. His restorations often went beyond preservation, turning ruin into vision, what he believed the medieval builders would have made had they possessed the resources. To some, his work was genius, to others, sacrilege. But either way, it revived the idea of the castle as something alive once more, not a relic, but a reborn icon of national identity. In Britain, this same impulse gave rise to the Gothic revival. The 19th century's architects began to design not just restorations, but new buildings in a deliberately medieval style. The Houses of Parliament, rebuilt after the fire of 1834, were designed like a vast castle, towers, turrets, and tracery echoing the age of knights and kings. Wealthy landowners, inspired by this taste for the medieval, built their own neo-castles, Penrhyn Castle in Wales, Alton Towers, and Castell Coch among them. These were not fortresses, of course. Their battlements were decorative, their moats ornamental, their portcullises purely symbolic. Yet they were built with sincerity, as expressions of continuity, of belonging to a lineage stretching back to the age of chivalry. The castle had become not a defense against invasion, but a defense against forgetting. And even as the new century turned, that impulse deepened. The ruins that had once inspired poets now became objects of study. Archaeologists and historians began to catalogue, excavate, and analyze the remains of medieval strongholds. The 20th century brought method to memory. Scholars mapped foundations, reconstructed floor plans, and pieced together fragments of pottery and weaponry. Yet, as the world modernized, a quiet tension grew between preservation and progress. Many castles stood in the path of expanding cities, or crumbling under their own weight. Some were lost forever, demolished, abandoned, or drowned beneath reservoirs and roads. Others were saved only at the last moment, stabilized with scaffolds and concrete, or handed over to the care of new institutions, trusts, museums, heritage boards. The world wars added another layer of irony. Many medieval castles, once designed for war, suffered under modern bombardment. Yet even then, their symbolic power persisted. Some were used as military headquarters or observation posts. Others became refuges for civilians. A few were damaged beyond repair, their stones shattered by the very machines that had rendered them obsolete centuries before. After 1945, as Europe rebuilt itself, the castle took on a new meaning. It was no longer a symbol of feudal control, but of shared heritage, a memory of endurance. In ruins, people saw not division, but continuity. The idea of preservation evolved from a personal passion into a collective responsibility. Organisations like English Heritage, Historic Scotland, and Monuments Historiques in France began to care systematically for these sites. The focus shifted from restoration to conservation, not to make castles new again, but to let them remain honestly old. Today, the modern visitor finds the castle in many forms. Some still stand proud and complete, like Windsor, Edinburgh, or Prague Castle, their flags still flying. Others remain empty shells, open to the sky, their walls green with moss and their stones warm under the sun. A few are little more than outlines, a mound, a ditch, a faint ring of earth that once held meaning. Each, in its own way, tells the same quiet story, that time erases function but preserves form, that what was once practical can become sacred simply by enduring. If you stand today among the ruins of Conwy or Carcassonne, you will still see the logic of their design. The angles of defense are still visible, the symmetry of towers still pleases the eye. Yet you also feel something else, a stillness, a kind of peace that comes only when purpose has ended but beauty remains. The castle, in the modern world, has become a mirror. For some, it reflects pride, a symbol of national identity, craftsmanship, or endurance. For others, it reflects sorrow, a reminder of violence, conquest, and class. For most, it reflects wonder, the feeling of standing before something older than memory, built by hands now long gone, yet still here. Preservation is not simply about stone. It is about continuity, the human wish to remain connected to those who came before. Each restored arch, each stabilized wall, each guided tour is a quiet defiance of time's erosion. And yet, in preserving these places, we also reshape them. Every decision about what to save, what to restore, what to leave as ruin, each choice becomes part of the story itself. The medieval castle continues to change, even now in our care. Because the genius of its design was not only that it could withstand the weapons of its own age, but that it could adapt to ours, surviving not as a fortress, but as a memory made tangible. And as the modern world grows noisier, faster, and more fragile, these old stones offer something rare: silence, solidity, and the faint echo of human hands working carefully, patiently, toward permanence. Perhaps that is why we still go to them, to walk their walls, to climb their towers, to feel the chill of their stairways. We do not go to see how they defended the past. We go to remember that they did. There is a particular kind of silence that exists only within the walls of an old castle. It is not empty, but full of echoes, of footsteps that no longer fall, of doors that no longer close. It is a silence made from centuries of sound, layered upon one another, until all that remains is the faint hum of memory. This is where castles now live, not in battlefields or borders, but in imagination. They have become architecture, not just of stone, but of thought. They are how we picture the Middle Ages, how we dream of lost ages, how we imagine power, fear, and romance. The castle has become the shape of the past in our collective minds. When you picture a medieval world, you likely begin with a castle. Towers on a hill, a banner stirring in the wind, walls gleaming against a grey sky. It is an image that feels eternal, but in truth, it is an invention, shaped, refined, and retold over hundreds of years. The real castles were often smaller, muddier, less perfect. Their towers leaned, their walls crumbled, their moats smelled of the animals that lived nearby. But in imagination, the castle became idealized, not a building, but a symbol. Every generation rebuilt it differently. For the Romantics, the castle was a ruin touched by melancholy, a place where time itself could be seen eroding history, stone by stone. For the Gothic novelists, it became a vessel for dread and mystery, a house of secrets and haunting. For the Victorians, it was the setting of chivalric honour, of knights, tournaments, and tragic queens. And for the modern world, it is something gentler, a dream of wonder, of fairy tales, of safety enclosed by stone and story. But beneath all these shifting images lies something constant, the idea that a castle is a container of memory. In a way, every castle is a form of storytelling. Its layers of stone are like pages, some still legible, some eroded beyond reading. The foundations tell of the original builder's fears and ambitions. The later additions tell of changing needs, changing styles, changing technologies. The ruins tell of abandonment, of time's quiet indifference. To walk through a castle today is to walk through a living palimpsest, history written, erased, and rewritten over itself. The spiral staircase, worn smooth at the center by countless feet, is not just a detail of design, it is a record of use. The soot on the ceiling, the weathered arrow slit, the uneven stonework in a repaired wall, each is an artifact of human persistence. And so the castle endures not only as an object, but as a way of remembering. It shapes how we think about permanence and loss. It shows that beauty can come from endurance, that fragility and strength can coexist in the same form. In literature and film, this idea persists powerfully. When filmmakers or writers wish to evoke timelessness, they reach for the castle, the stronghold atop a cliff, the keep on a lonely moor, the fortress in the mist. Whether it stands in Camelot or Winterfell, Hogwarts or Gormenghast, the meaning is the same. Within these walls, time behaves differently. Inside, the past is preserved. Outside, the world changes. Even in fantasy, the castle remains grounded in the real human desires that built it. The need to define a boundary, to keep danger out, to create order in chaos. The dragons, the wizards, the enchantments, they are only echoes of older fears. Raiders, famine, war. The architecture of the imagination still follows the logic of survival. Yet the modern world views the castle with gentler eyes. It is no longer a place of dominance or dread. but of fascination. We restore them not to live in, but to remember living. We wander through them not as vassals or invaders, but as pilgrims. Tour guides tell their stories in calm, measured tones, how a tower was once a prison, how a chapel once echoed with song, how a bridge once lifted with the creak of chains. We listen not for excitement, but for connection. The castle has become a space of quiet reverence, where the imagination and the past meet halfway. There is also something deeply psychological in the way we hold castles in memory. The fortress represents protection, the sense of a safe enclosure in a dangerous world. It is an image that begins in childhood, in stories of knights and dragons, and lingers into adulthood as a metaphor for security itself. When we dream of castles, we dream not only of history, but of sanctuary. And yet there is an irony in that comfort. The same walls that once promised safety also trapped those within them. In times of siege, the castle could become a prison. In times of peace, it could become a monument to isolation. The human mind, too, builds its own castles. Walls of certainty, moats of fear, gates that open only rarely. Perhaps that is why the image endures so powerfully. Because the castle is not just part of history, it is part of how we understand ourselves. The genius of its design, practical, mathematical, defensive, is also emotional. It appeals to something ancient within us, the desire to belong somewhere that endures, somewhere that cannot be easily taken away. To stand inside a castle ruin today is to feel that continuity. The stones are weathered, but they still stand. The wind moves through open windows where once glass glimmered and banners hung. You may find yourself tracing your fingers along the walls, feeling the texture of time, the coolness of the stone, the faint hum of history. It is an architecture not only of memory, but of imagination. Because in the end, what keeps castles alive is not mortar, but meaning. We keep rebuilding them, in books, in films, in fantasy, in our thoughts, because they give form to the things we cannot otherwise touch: permanence, longing, loss, wonder. The genius of the medieval castle was never only in its strength, but in its symbolism, its ability to be both real and imagined, both physical and eternal. The walls that once defined territories now define emotions. The towers that once watched for invaders now watch over dreams. And yet, even now, the castle continues to evolve. As modern architects design museums, memorials, and even virtual worlds, they borrow the same language: enclosure, threshold, ascent, defense, light, and shadow. The principles of the medieval fortress remain embedded in the blueprint of human creativity. Because in the end, the castle is not just something humanity once built, it is something humanity keeps rebuilding, in stone, in story, and in mind. And though its wars are over, its purpose remains, to remind us that memory, like stone, endures, even as the world around it changes. At the end of all things, when the banners have faded, the wars forgotten, and the kings unnamed, the castle remains, not whole, not victorious, but standing. It stands as a skeleton of history, half devoured by time, yet defiant. Walls crumble, roofs fall, ivy creeps through the arrow slits and over the battlements. But beneath the ruin, there is still a pulse, slow, quiet, enduring. The pulse of memory held in stone. To walk among the ruins of a medieval castle is to stand in two times at once. In one, there is silence, only the whisper of the wind and the call of crows overhead. In the other, there is life, the clang of armor, the creak of drawbridges, the murmur of servants carrying bread and wine. The two worlds overlap like faint ghosts, half visible through each other. It is this strangeness, this sense of being between worlds, that gives ruins their power. They are both alive and dead. They remind us that nothing lasts, and yet that something always remains. For centuries, the ruin has fascinated poets, painters, and travelers. To the romantics of the 18th and 19th centuries, a ruined castle was the perfect image of melancholy, nature reclaiming the works of man. They painted ivy-draped towers under silver skies, not as symbols of loss, but of harmony, a reconciliation between humanity and time. The ruin was proof that beauty did not end when purpose did, but long before the poets, ordinary people understood this too. Villagers built their homes from fallen castle stones, carrying pieces of the past into their own lives. Farmers ploughed around the ruins, letting their fields embrace the crumbled walls. Shepherds grazed their flocks where knights once trained. Life flowed around the remnants, accepting them as part of the landscape. Time, in its patience, does not destroy. It transforms. The sharp edges of the fortress soften. The walls, once designed to repel, become places where wildflowers bloom. Owls nest in arrow loops. Grass grows on the battlements. The ruin becomes a second kind of architecture, not of war, but of peace. And yet, even as nature reclaims these places, they continue to exert a quiet gravity on human imagination. The ruin is a reminder of mortality, but also of endurance. It tells us that though empires fall, though human ambition fades, the idea of permanence still haunts us. There is something profoundly human in that paradox. We know that all things must end, yet we build as if they will not. We carve our hopes into stone, trusting, or perhaps pleading, that they will outlast us. The medieval builders, laying foundation stones in the chill of morning, could not have known how long their work would stand. Many of them never saw the castles completed. Some died before the final tower rose. But their labour was a gesture toward eternity. A statement that in this fragile world there might be something that endures. And somehow, impossibly, many of those gestures survived. Even now, as modern travellers stand among the ruins, the same emotion stirs, awe mixed with humility. 1,000 years have passed, and still the stones hold their shape, their purpose transformed, but not erased. They have become not fortresses, but monuments, to endurance, to time, and to the quiet persistence of human memory. In the twilight hours, when the sun sinks behind a castle ruin and the sky turns to gold, the outlines blur, battlements become silhouettes, towers melt into the horizon. The castle seems to dissolve back into the earth, as if returning to where it began. Earth became stone, stone became wall, wall became ruin, ruin became earth again. A full circle, slow and inevitable. And yet, the idea remains. Children still draw castles on paper, with turrets, flags, and moats. Storytellers still build them in imagination. Historians still trace their plans, their names, their histories. The ruin may fade, but the shadow of the castle stretches far beyond its stones. Because the castle is not just a relic, it is a mirror. It reflects our longing for safety, our fear of loss, our wish to be remembered. We build walls around our memories, towers around our hopes, moats around our pain. And like the builders of old, we hope those walls will stand a little longer than we do. So when we gaze upon a castle ruin, its windows open to the wind, its towers roofless against the stars, we are not only seeing what remains of the past, we are seeing what remains of ourselves. It is a reminder that everything we build, cities, nations, even dreams, will someday fall to silence. But in that silence, there will still be traces. The mark of a hand on stone, the ghost of a wall against the light, the faint echo of a voice once carried through the halls. That is the true legacy of the medieval castle. Not the wars it survived, nor the lords who ruled within it, but the enduring human desire to last. And though the centuries will continue to wear its stones away, the idea, the vision of the castle, will remain, strong as ever. In every story told, in every ruin visited, in every dream of distant ages, it will stand once more upon the hill, watching the horizon, casting its long shadow across eternity. Because the castle, in the end, was never merely a fortress. It was, and still is, the architecture of our own immortality. And so, as the last light fades from the walls of history, the castles rest. The towers, once sharp against the sky, now soften into silhouettes. The echoes of hammers and voices, banners and drums, all are gone. What remains is stillness. You might imagine yourself walking there now, through a gate that no longer closes, over grass that once was a courtyard. The stones beneath your feet are cool, worn smooth by centuries of footsteps. A breeze moves through the hollow windows, like a sigh from another age. Every castle you have ever seen or dreamed of began as an idea. A need to be safe, a hope to be remembered, a wish to keep the world at bay. And though the world has changed, that wish remains the same. Stone was their answer. And though time proved that even stone is not forever, it has given us something else, something quieter, something deeper. In the ruins, we see not failure, but endurance. Not decay, but memory. Each fallen wall is a page half read, each tower a thought unfinished. And if you listen closely, you can still hear the rhythm of the centuries, patient, unhurried, unbothered by our passing. The genius of the medieval castle was never just in its design, but in its faith. The belief that something built with care could outlast its maker. And in a way, it has. You, here now, are proof of that. You have followed their story, felt their silence, carried their shadow. Perhaps that is all the builders ever hoped for, that someone, somewhere, might remember. So let the stones rest now. Let the halls fall quiet again. Let the centuries close their eyes. And as you drift into sleep, imagine the castle not as a ruin, but as it once was. Whole, proud, alive with the glow of torchlight. The walls warm, the air still. A hearth burning quietly in the great hall. The drawbridge raised. The night outside, calm and endless. The fortress endures, in memory, in imagination, and for this moment, in you. Sleep well, traveller. The castle stands watch still,